Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be having a look at points. So we're going to look at the different sizes of points. We're going to look at Electrofrog, Insulfrog, and talk about the new Unifrog points. We're also then going to have a look at point motors, the ones I use, how I wire them up, and then finally we'll look at fitting the point onto the layout. So here we have a selection of points. So we got a medium radius left hand point, larger radius right hand point, larger radius again, right hand point, a curved point, a three-way point, and a double slip, which is the same as having 2 points back to back. So if you imagine you had the points like this, that's the same as a double slip. And you can see a double slip takes up far less space than 2 points. So it's very, very handy to have on your layout. Now there's lots of different other points. There's a Y point, for example. All these points will come in a left and right hand version. So there's a huge selection of points out there to fit any layout. It's always better to have the biggest radius you can have to give a smooth transition for your train to move on to another track. But what we'll do now is we'll just have one of these and we'll have a closer look at it and just explain the different parts of the point and how it works. So here we have a small radius point. This would be the sort of common point that most people would have on their layouts. It comes in a lot of train sets. This is obviously a left-hand point because it goes off to the left. So how do they work? Well, the train would come in from this direction and the blades are switched to send it off in whichever direction. At the moment it's set to go straight, but if we flick the blades, you can see now this blade will take it off that exit. Likewise, if you have a train coming from this way, the blades have to be set for it to come in that way, because if it's not, it will derail. So if it was set like this and the train comes in, it'll just derail, cause a short, and all your trains will stop. Now, the way of moving these blades, it can either be by hand, like this, or you can have a point motor. These point motors are usually under the layout, with a pin that comes through the center there to flick it over. They can be surface mounted point motors as well. Or you can have a simple rod and tube method attached to here to move it. So we'll look at the point motors I use. They're Seep point motors which go underneath the baseboard, and I'll show you how those work later on. But if we look at some of the parts now, so the outside rails, so this rail and that rail, are called the stock rails. As we said, these are the blades which move, and they're attached to the tie bar, which moves the blades. And then we have this area here, which is the frog, and you also have check rails here. These help guide the wheels as it's going over the frog to make sure it's going in the right direction. Now, as I said, you can get Electrofrog and Insulfrog and Unifrog. Unifrog is a new one bought out by Pico. It sort of combines the benefits of Electrofrog and Insulfrog together. They're only available in certain points at the moment. They will be replacing them as needed with Pico. As their dies run out, they will be replacing them with the new version of the Frog. So I think they're only available in some N gauge, O gauge, some bullhead rail stock as well. But they are gradually coming out and replaced. And I'll talk about them and explain how they're different to the other frogs as we go along. So we move that up. We have over here, this is a Hornby left hand. You can see how it's the same. It's got the blades, tie bar, but if you notice the frog on here is plastic, whereas on the Pico it's metal. So this is an Insulfrog, this is an Electrofrog. Electrofrogs are better because obviously if you're running small engines with only a couple of pickups, they're not going to lose power anywhere here because this bit is powered. Whereas on the Insulfrog, it's plastic, it's not powered. So if your wheel hits that, and it's only the only wheel that's got a pickup that's working, your engine's likely to stop if it doesn't have enough momentum to get over. So I use Electrofrogs because they're far more reliable, and I'll show you how I wire them up later on. But we'll just explain now how the current flow works. So with both of them, when you flick them, the power is picked up on these rails and carries on through. With the Electrofrog, when you flick it, it actually powers the frog. So on these you have to have insulated fish plates on here, or else it will cause a short when you flick it over. So as you flick it, it picks up the power from the joining rail, takes it through and powers the frog. Not required on the Insulfrog. You don't need the insulated rails, because when you flick it over, it only powers that rail. Likewise, when you flick it that way, it only powers that rail, so it doesn't cause a short, so you don't need insulated fish plates on this, but you do on the Electrofrog. Now, to make the Electrofrog more reliable, there is a way I wire them up, because obviously if you're relying on the power here to come through these rails, over time it's going to get tarnished, you're going to get little bits of dirt in there, and it's not going to have great electrical connectivity. So on the frogs, underneath, they have a wire coming out from them. That you can wire up. And this is where your point motor comes in. It needs to have a switch on it, so it can switch the priority off the frog to make sure you have the right power going through there. So I've got a point that I've already wired up, and I'll just talk you through that. So here you can see I've got a right hand point which I've wired up, and we'll just go through that now. So depending on your wiring configuration, obviously with mine I always have black to the back and red to the front. So for me the black is the negative, the red is the positive. That's my wiring convention, so I just make sure they're soldered on the right way depending on which way this point is sitting on the layout. So obviously if it was like that, then black would have to be on this side. So if you can see on this one here, so this is a newer Pico one, you can see it's got two little wires that bridge the gap there. So you need to cut those wires off, and then cut some of this plastic away here and put your wires in. As you can see, I've done on this one here. Let that come in. You can see I've cut the wires away, so there's a gap there now, so they're not connecting. And I've wired a black across these two rails and a red across those two rails, and also the frog wire, which is sticking out, I've put a green wire on that. Obviously green for a frog. And I've put insulating fish plates on there. Okay, so that's preparing your point now for putting onto the layout. And you can see it has its own power supply coming into it. You're going to use your point motor with a switch on it to control the priority going up to here. So you're not just relying on this to supply the power. It makes it much, much more reliable. So now we'll have a look at the point motor I use. So these are the point motors I use. It's a Seep point motor. It's got a latching switch on it, which I'll show you now, one I've wired up. And you can see it's just a little solenoid. It flicks backwards and forwards, changing the point. And it's wired up with yellow will go off to the switch, and the red on the end goes off to the switch, and the black there is the common black. We'll go over more of this when I'm actually fitting it and you can see the wiring in place, but this is just an overview for the minute. And then we have the power supply here, so this would go off to your bus, so the black and red there, and obviously the green gets connected to your frog. So that switches the priority on the frog to make sure it's got the right priority of electricity going through it. Okay, so that's the Seatpoint motor. So it sits like that on the baseboard. The pin comes up through and it moves backwards and forwards, changing the point and also changing the priority going to the frog. So the new Unifrog that's coming out from Pico, it combines the same as the Insulfrog and the Electrofrog together. So when you buy it off the shelf, a Unifrog one, the frog itself, if you imagine, there is a little sliver of plastic going across here. So the frog is electrically dead, so it's like an Insulfrog one. It does have the wire coming out the back, so you can wire it up the same with a switch to turn it into an Electrofrog. So out of the packet. You don't need to do anything with it, additional wiring or anything like that. You can just put it on the layout and use it. But if you're going to use it as an Electrofrog point, then it's the same method as the current Electrofrogs. But you won't need insulating fish plates, because all you're doing is you're going to be electrifying the small frog part. These two rails here are insulated from the frog. Hope that makes sense. But they seem pretty simple and pretty standard to operate. Just a note on powering your point motors. You need a power supply. Always best to have a CDU. This is a capacitor discharge unit. Basically this takes your power, stores it in the capacitors, and when you flick the momentary switch, it sends a boost of power to the solenoid to flick it over. So this is the sort of switch you need. It's a momentary switch, so you flick it up, it returns to center, and you flick it down, returns to center for changing the point direction. Now for my new layout, I am using one of these from DCC Concepts. This is a power supply and CDU built into one. So power goes in through the back from the mains, and then it gives an output from here. You send to your points. So it's been recommended to me. I've tried it out. It seems to work very, very well here. So I'm going to carry on using it, and at a later date then I can give you an update on how it actually performs. So let's get on with the fitting of the point. So I have my point here, it's all wired up, ready to be fitted. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put it in place, and then we'll take a look at how I mark everything out. Point's in place, so I need to mark some holes. Need a hole underneath the tie bar for the point motor, so I'm holding the blades in the central position, so they're not switched either way, they're just held in the center position. Take my pin vise, drill through the center hole just to mark the wood. I'm also marking where the wires go down for the feed, and I'm also going to mark where the wires go down for the frog. Then I take the point away. Now I have a drill here with a 10mm spade bit on it, which is going to be for the hole for the point motor to come through. So I put that on the mark and I start to drill. So it's going to get a bit loud now. Hold on. Now I have another bit. This is just about a 4mm bit, just to make a hole for the wires to go through. So I find my marks, drill through. And vacuum up the mess. So you can see now 10mm hole for the rod of the point motor to come through, a hole for the feed and for the frog. Now obviously on your baseboard you're going to have to make sure that there's nothing underneath you're going to drill through, and also that your cross members aren't going to be in the way of the point motor. Now luckily this has worked out. My cross member is actually over here, so it's not going to interfere with the point motor here. So it's something you have to be aware of when you're placing your points. Is there anything underneath that's going to interfere with the placing of the point motor? Now we just take the point and feed the wires through. Just pull them through. So you notice on this point that I have insulated fish plates at all exits. It's because I'm hoping in the future to do block detection, so I want to keep them all separate so I can have different blocks. If you're not doing block detection, you only need insulated fish plates on these two here coming off the frog. So now it's in place, we'll just check in. Yep, I can see the hole underneath. There's going to be plenty of room there for the rod from the point motor to come up through and switch it. So I'm happy with the placement of that. So again, I'll get my pin vise. I'm just going to put a hole in a sleeper just so I can put a pin through just to secure it. So I'll carry on and do that. And then we'll have a look at the point motor, how to fit that and wire it up. So here's the point motor. It's all wired up. So we're going to fit this now. You'll notice on this side here I have a little piece of plastic. This holds the pin centered. And this will become apparent why as we're doing the fitting. To make sure it's the right orientation, so that way around as opposed to that way around, I go by my wiring convention, so it's black to the back, so I know it goes that way. So I'm going to feed it through now the hole in the tie bar. Now this is easier to do if you have a light below the baseboard, so you can see the light coming up through. Makes it a little bit easier to feed it through. And then I just hold it in place, little crocodile clip on there like that. So you'll notice the tie bar on that's quite short. It's obviously because that's what they're like when they're new. This is off one of my old layouts, so I'm reusing it. So normally what you do once you're finished fitting is you would cut off the excess so you don't need. So that's in place now. What we're going to do now is I've got some cut up coffee stirrers and I put them either side of the blades, and they're just the right width to hold the blades central. So we have the bar from the point motor centered and the blade centered. So now we're almost ready to screw the point motor in. You may notice that there's a hole drilled here. This is in line with the tie bar orientation. This tells me what orientation I have to put the point motor in, because it needs to be the same orientation as the tie bar, or when it throws it won't throw the blades. So that's just for a visual indication. When I'm underneath working, I can make sure it's lined up correctly. So we'll go into the baseboard now. Here we are under the baseboard. Got the point motor there. Just make out the hole there. That's showing us the orientation of the tie bar. So we need to line the point motor up with that hole. Also remembering to keep the black towards the back so we know it's right for the wiring. And then we want to line this up with that hole. And then we just have a couple of screws just to hold it in place. So we line it up and just put one screw in to begin with. Then we just take that bit of plastic off, and then we can just do some testing with just one screw in, just to make sure it is right before we put the other screw in, just to tie it in place. You can see, I take you on top. Where is it? There it is. You can see now if I flick the motor underneath, it's moving the blades correctly, backwards and forwards. There's no hindrance to it, so it's working fine. So I'm just going to put the other screw in now and secure it, and then we'll look at connecting up the wiring. Right, I'm going to try and show you this the best I can. It's always hard when you're working upside down underneath the baseboard. We have the green wire there, and that is connected to the green wire coming down from the frog. We have the black and red feed. They're tied into the black and red feed from the point, and that's going off to a temporary feed at the moment to the buzz wire for testing. And then the wires that actually switch the point, so the red and the yellow and the common black, they're going through that hole we drilled for the orientation up onto the top, so I can wire it into a switch and test it and make sure it works and it throws the way I want it to and everything is working correctly. So let's go back on top of the baseboard. So here's a temporary switch panel which I've made up on a scrap piece of wood for this area of the storage yard. You can see how the switches reflect each point. So we're going to be wiring into this switch here. If we turn it over, you can see how the middle terminal of each switch is connected together, with the red going off to the positive side of the power supply. And the black is wired into the common black coming off the point motor. And that leaves the yellow and red, which will be attached to either side of the switch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some crocodile clips, temporarily connect them purely just so we can test the point and make sure everything's working as it should be. So I'm just going to connect those up now and then I'll show you when I'm done. So you can see there, crocodile clip is just temporarily holding it in place. So remember, when you're doing all this sort of wiring or anything on the layout, the power should all be switched off, because if you cause a short, it can damage your locos, damage your switches, damage your electrical equipment. So just have it all off while you're doing wiring and only have it on when you're actually ready to test. So let's flip this board over. And we'll plug in the power supply and we'll see what happens. Power's on, it's all connected up. Let's flick the switch and see what happens. You can see it's quite a positive movement. There's full movement there. It's making good contact. We'll use my little track tester now to test that the frog is actually working. So we're going straight on, so we'll check these tracks. Yep, 2 lights. We check the other tracks, they're dead. So if we flick the switch, that one should be live, and that one's dead. So the frog is working correctly. So we've wired it up correctly, we're happy with the throw, everything's working. Now I can solder those connections and finish the job off. So there you go, that's how I fit my points on point motors. Hope you find it interesting. If you've lasted this long, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. If you've got any further questions, put them in the comments down below. I do have a live stream that I do every Thursday at 7:30 Irish time. You're welcome to come into that, and if you've got any questions you can ask in the chat, and I'm sure if I can't answer them, somebody in the chat will be able to. So thanks for watching, I'll see you next time, bye for now.